And I'll have to insert something there because I forgot to put that in my notes. Like, absolute monkey.
Fuck with monkeys. Fuck with straw.
Jesus.
Nuzzle in them monkeys.
Jesus. Hello and welcome to the QUACKCAST, the Drunkduck QUACKCAST. I am Ozone Ocean, and with me is Bates. Hi, Bates.
Hello.
Tance.
Hello.
And Pitbase.
Oh, hello.
Hello. Okay, so we're all together, and this week we're talking about how the place you sort of grew up in influenced your comicking. How did it influence your comicking, in what way? Which is just something I came up with in the forums. I just decided, I really don't know how my childhood influenced my comicking, and so I wanted to find out. And I also wanted to find out how other people's childhoods influenced their writing as well, or their creation. Not just their writing, but, also their artwork and everything. So, yeah, I was curious. And we're going to explore that, and it could turn up some interesting things. But before we get into that, QUACKCAST is going to tell us about the comic she featured this week, which was called Click Track Lolita. So, Quai, tell us about Click Track Lolita.
Hello, this is QUACKCAST, and the feature I've selected for this week is Click Track Lolita by Zero Becoming X, and it is rated T14. When Sierra, a fashionable young girl, visits her grandmother's home in the idyllic fairy tale cottage in the woods, life looks like it is more comfortable. She heads over to town for groceries and to visit Lacey at the local bar when she discovers Lacey has snagged a slot in the live music performances that weekend. After bumping into Will, the seemingly cool punk rocker, Lacey's life might take a turn for the interesting. The art is drawn in black and white in a full-page format. Tune in to the latest updates to find out how Sierra and Will's first meeting turns out, and read Click Track Lolita by Zero Becoming X, rated T.
Okay, we're back. QUACKCAST, thank you very much for that comic, Click Track Lolita. Right, next up, we have the featured music. This week, Gun Wallace has given us the theme to Crucial Corona Chronicles. Rhythmic pulsing, blood pumping through veins, platelets and white blood cells surging through vessels, nasty globular corona cells invading and populating, multiplying, spreading, echoing the sickness of society as they populate and change every corner. So, take it away, Gun Wallace, with Crucial Corona Chronicles. That was our great coronavirus comic, Crucial Corona Chronicles. This is a comic by QUACKCAST, which is, or should I just say GRKZTR, rated M, and it's about a comic about people's experiences during the epidemic or pandemic that we have at the moment. So, let's get into the QUACKCAST. The topic of the QUACKCAST is, of course, how the situation you grew up in influenced your comics as, later in life, or influenced your creation. And we talked about this in our Patreon-only video. You can see us chatting about it in all the different ways, and we'll reiterate a bit of that stuff here, but we won't go into quite the, exactly what we did there, because, we have to have a little bit extra for you beautiful, lovely people who actually pay to watch our videos, and we thank you for that because it helps support our site. So, I began this topic because I was just having a think, how did my childhood influence my comicking? And I didn't know. I couldn't work it out until I actually wrote it down in the forums, and that helped me sort of crystallize the idea in my head. And I think that was the same for a lot of other people as well. Because it's interesting to know, you don't often realize how things in your life have had an influence. You tend to think about, what did I like reading, or what did I like watching on TV, and how did that influence what I did? But often it's more formative experiences that can have, very interesting effects on what you create. Now, for me, when I was growing up, I grew up in Perth, Western Australia. This is a city of 2 million people, which is a reasonably big city, but very spread out, low population density generally. And I grew up in the suburbs, so, very green, lots of trees, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of my childhood was spent at the beach and, playing down at the river with my friends. And some of my childhood was spent in the country town of Busselton, which is a reasonably big country town. So I'd be visiting farms and, dairy farms and stuff like this, and going down to the beach, of course, and catching tadpoles at the river, all that kind of stuff. But so suburban childhoods, going down to there, going anywhere outside of the cities and towns into any of the rest of the state, because this is a gigantic state, it's bigger than Alaska, it's huge, is basically all desert. So it's just a little tiny pocket of green down the bottom, and everything else is desert. So a lot of my childhood was spent in very, very hot weather, harsh blue skies, very bright. There's no ruins here. There's nothing ancient. The older stuff is from the 19th century. So we'd look at like something in an antique shop that's 100 years old, and we thought, oh my God, that's so old. But, overseas, in other places, they have antiques hundreds of years. I mean, I have swords now that I've collected that, that are over 200 years old. So, yeah, so it's a very different kind of paradigm from the very new country I grew up in. And my writing, my comicking is all based on the stuff that I would have been reading and watching as a child. So I was really into fantasy, so we've got like snowy mountains and stuff like that where action's happening. We've got, ancient places, anything that's overseas, like, is very completely different here. Cities, like, you're looking at stuff about, TV shows about New York, very dense cities, everyone lives in apartments, all that kind of stuff. No one did that here. No one. When I grew up, there were almost no 2-story houses even. Where everyone lived on like 1 story because it's so hot here. Now we have 2-story houses, a lot of them. But back then, nothing like that was very, everything is very one level because, people were sensibly building because it was, very hot and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, so very, very, the vision that I saw of the world and that I liked of the world that I wanted to create stories about was very different from what I grew up in. So when I went to write stories that interest me about the worlds that interest me that I grew up reading, I had to be very imaginative. So almost everything I write is from imagination, and very little of what I write about is from my direct experience because, I've experienced some of that now in my travels overseas, But back then I hadn't experienced pretty much any of it. So a lot of it is, imagination. And there are problems because of that. Because if you create stuff from imagination and not from personal experience, you make mistakes and you have sort of exaggerated views of things or more cartoonish kind of images of stuff. That's what happens when you don't have the direct experience. So that's why my stuff is as it is. So anyway, I've blooded on a long time. So how about you guys? Your turn.
I'd say a lot of mine is like based on stuff I watched and stuff I loved and toys I played with and stuff like that. Movies and TV. Huge fan of TV. I'm always reminded of. I was like glued to it. Sesame Street, and then on down the
Oh, cool.
Cartoons, more edgy stuff for the time that would upset the mother, that we were even watching.
The mother.
The mother.
I like that.
Like old horror movies and stuff like that we would come upon, and when there was less, I don't know, there's maybe less policing now too, because online you can kind of find, kids can find anything, and like nobody knows what they're doing. We had a version of that where parents didn't really understand what was going on, like what kind of like trash, quote unquote, you could pick up in the video store and stuff like that.
The anime
So
show.
Like, well, we didn't have much, sadly. When I was a kid, I didn't see it till I was in high school, except for a tiny bit, and the tiny bit I saw was shocking for sure compared to the cartoons that we got on TV. But that was awesome, and like these grimy little horror movies and stuff like that. So definitely a lot of that, a lot of the environment of like old buildings and kind of shabby and crumbling stuff. I think I put that flavor into my comic, although I'm not a detailed enough artist that it really shows up probably. But a lot of that kind of stuff that I watched was the same thing. There was also, the environment when I was a kid could be kind of dangerous. You'd have houses fairly closely packed together, but you could walk literally for 5 minutes and find a large patch of bushland, this undeveloped land that was all trees, and you'd have these narrow pathways through, and saw some crazy stuff, like people, like kind of crazy dudes, like tenting out in the bush and stuff like that. Bushes that don't exist anymore, they were turned into little residential neighborhoods now and everything, but there's that flavor, an exaggerated version of that, I would say, in my comics, where it's like, you don't have to go too far before there's something dangerous. Like, you kind of step out of your regular path, and there's like weird and scary stuff going on. Like now that this topic's making me think about it more, like it was kind of like that, like it could be. There were some scary people in my neighborhood. And it's like, some hairy situations and stuff like that. So I
really
definitely,
cool.
Yeah, it is, yeah. So I would say there's definitely a lot of that in my comic, that kind of flavor of like, just go around the corner and like you got a villain waiting for you.
Yeah.
So please go ahead. I won't go on and on.
No, it's really interesting. I'm thinking, because I'm trying to think of something to say that I didn't say on the video cast. Because what you were talking about, for those kind of childhood or those old fears of the things that were out there, and almost kind of like the fear of the unknown in a sense, like that, undoubtedly that makes it into the things that you make. If you're writing about something that's supposed to be a bit tense or suspenseful and stuff like that. I don't know if I've done it to any comics that I've published on Drunkduck or anything like that, but dang, I'm really trying to think of some examples. Tanya, do you have anything you could say while I swirl in circles around this open drain pipe, which was a fear of mine back in the day, so that's probably in something.
Yeah,
Well, as I was listening to both of you guys, I realized that way before I even thought of making any sort of comic, when I was drawing, even as a kid, I always had to have certain elements in the drawing, in the kids' drawing, and that would be mountains in the back, preferably with some sea that you could glimpse at, and very, very blue sky, very intensely green trees and stuff on more or less cement, and the house. So these elements definitely reflect where I have grown up, which is Athens. And the idea is that for me, everything is and has been very much in high relief, I would say. And we always grew up, I remember feeling that we are in a sort of bubble, and outside this bubble there are all sorts of threats and perils that our ancestors have faced, but we haven't. And that might be a problem because we might be the soft generation, for example. I remember growing up in the 80s and the 90s. The idea was that we were living in a very protected and calm environment, able to enjoy only the beautiful parts of being, in Greece and everything. Whereas every place we were used to be super dangerous and super ugly just a few decades ago. And when I say a few decades ago, I don't mean World War II. I mean the 70s and other little bouts of violence here and there in the post-war era in Greece. And there was always also the threat that beyond our borders, there were still the beasts in the lair, as it would be alluded to in different songs and stuff, and that would be basically most of the other Balkan nations wanting some chunks of our land here and there, like a little, trying to nibble on our borders and things like this. And the feeling that at the drop of a hat, at any given moment, you could be suddenly, without realizing it, into war. And it might sound fantastical, but we grew up with this as a very tangible and possible situation, almost like, I would say, like the Cold War and the nuclear bomb scare or the nuclear war scare that would exist in general. We also had our smaller scale scares that would be like, for example, oh my God, the Turks just came in and we are threatening to sink one of their boats. And what will happen if this sinks? But if we don't sink it, what will happen might be worse, and things like that. And this still goes on up until today. So in my writing, there is always a writing that involves a big threat of some sort, always. Not only now without Moonlight, which is a very historical comic, and it's basically my exploration of one of those very ugly times in our history. But when I was making other stories like Wolf, or that's the one I have on Drunkduck, because it's still about dealing with an asymmetric threat, if you like. And a virus, a plague, some kind of corporation that is trying to control it or not control it, and blah, blah, blah. That sort of thing. So, yeah, there's that.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about that. Yeah, because I grew up with the whole threat of the Cold War as well. As though we were sort of thinking, oh, we are a long way away from it, that we would be very, we'd be the last people to feel the effects. But, there were protests all the time at American military bases we had here. There weren't that many, but, there was a major...
If you can't tell from the deep accent. See, I can't even do the accent.
There was a major US listening base in a place called Exmouth, which I actually visited as a child, and that was like, massive aerials and stuff like this to listen in on, communication from the Russians and everyone else, I suppose. Huge spy base. And yeah, so that would have been a target. And so there was always that fear, like it would go away and people wouldn't be sort of thinking about the Cold War, but then you would, and like every sound, how you hear that late at night there's the sound of an aeroplane flying overhead and everything else is quiet.
Just like even before you started describing it, I almost heard it in a sense because I hear it here all the time. You said late at night, I automatically thought of a plane. Yeah, just that very atmospheric.
Yeah. Or sometimes it could be like it can roar like just a roaring kind of sound, and you think, what if that is like a missile coming over? And the reality is you wouldn't, by the time a missile was coming over you, there'd be no sound because it would have burned up all its stages and it would just be orbiting and it would just be coming in to drop the payload. There'd be no flame or anything behind it. It would just be silent as it dropped down and hit the ground. It would be dead silent. Yeah. So yeah, if you can hear a sound, then you don't have to worry. There's no missile coming. But as a child, I did think.
Now that you mention it, like over here, we have a lot of quote-unquote dogfights because they're not real dogfights in the sense that no plane is getting dropped by each other. But when the Turkish planes come into our airspace, we have our own planes that go to intercept them and force them to go back, and they sort of lock on each other and things like this. And we hear them crossing over Athens to go towards the borders, and often they pass very, very low, and even though you know that it's likely that they are your planes, like the Greek ones and not the Turkish ones, and they are simply just getting into formation or whatever it is they're doing, when they are so very, very low, it feels very intimidating, like something clenches inside of you when you hear that sound, because it feels like, okay, what if they are not actually our planes and they have come this far in? Well, then, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's living with a constant threat that you don't feel it every time, but when you do, when it comes to the forefront of your consciousness, it is very intense. So that sort of, waiting for the other shoe to drop sort of thing, I think I have it as a sensation, like the suspense in my stories revolves around that, like waiting for things to go south, waiting for everything to just collapse. And
Oh, really? How grim.
Yeah. It's not, I suppose it can be grim, but the idea is like I'm waiting for this to happen so that I can see what I will do with it, in a sense. I don't know if it's very hard to describe. We even have songs, very, very popular songs in Greece that Greece is cursed to live in war with certain
It's
breaks
something
of
you're
peace.
always aware to a point, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah,
You're always aware of it to a
exactly.
point.
Exactly, but never with the idea that, oh my God, we're all gonna die. It's with the, okay, since this seems that it's not going away and it's probably going to happen, let's get on with it so that we can see how to deal with this and just put it behind us, in a sense, which is not a good thing. But yeah, it's a sort of exasperation that people are feeling as a communal existence over here. I'm tired of having this happen. I'm tired of an impasse. I'm tired of this situation. So let's get on with it, even if it's going to be worse before it gets better. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, okay. But what about you, Bones? What was your growing up experience like with the whole idea of, looming disaster? Or didn't you even think about that?
I don't know, man. Like, in my memory at least, like that kind of those fears came later,
Oh, really?
teenagehood, when I learned more. I don't remember being really aware of that kind of stuff, and then getting very fearful about it and concerned about it later on. Yeah, it was more just like, yeah, I don't know. The threats felt more personal, I guess. I didn't really think about the outside world in a very deep way or anything like that at all.
Well, okay. So
You know,
more of
very
a...
young parents struggling, but they kept us kind of. I mean, the idea of being like Greece being protected and being a bubble, but having these threats on the outside, like that hits home for me in a way. Whereas, like my parents were, like I said, super young, working hard, trying to keep it all together, and they did a good job of it. But right outside the door, like it was tough. Like it was a tough neighborhood. It was like, some good friends, some good kids, but you could go around and be like some psycho kid who'd be like hitting you with a stick, like half a block away from your house. It was like freaking crazy out there sometimes. So it was more stuff like that made a big impression. I was kind of, and then a lot of TV. Like a lot of my energy went into. I mean, I was drawing already. I was like really into reading and learning how to read, and
Was there an
that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So I can't think of any real like maybe I just don't remember or something. But yeah, that kind of thing feels like it didn't really touch me.
Was there an aspect of
later.
Escapism from the environment you were in, like there was for me?
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was tough. There was some tough times, and some of the adults around me even really were kind of. My dad was great, but he had a dark, like upbringing, and some of the people he knew, and the people I knew through him and through my parents were like. They were okay with us, but they were scary. Like there was a wildness to some of these people.
Interesting.
He's kind of semi-hillbilly and kind of a lot of drinkers, like pretty hardcore drinkers, and kind of half mountain people. Even though they were in the city, there was some scary folks with like a dark side. So it was there. It was kind of like always there. When I read Stephen King's It many years later, and like I don't know if you guys have read that, but like about them growing up in a small town in the 50s and how like a lot of the people are kind of scary. Like a lot of the adults are kind of like how that. I really could relate to that in a way. Like it's like, yeah, that. Some people that were like, it was like, are we going home soon? Like, don't leave me here.
Oh,
Please stay with
wow.
me. There's something just beyond view that I probably. I mean, I'm not talking about anything specific like
Just
crimes
a feeling.
or anything, but
Yeah.
just like a little bit of a savagery in a way to some of the people, like a little bit
No,
of
that's
The
wildness.
vulnerability. Like, you know
Yeah.
that the world's not going to be kind to you just because you're a kid. If anything, it makes you all the more vulnerable to the bad shit out there that you don't know or don't understand yet. And since you're a kid, it also adds that people might not necessarily believe you either if you see something, monsters or whatnot, you know, that kind of thought, and nobody's going to believe me if I say I saw this or that kind of thing, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
You know, that's amazing.
Yeah, well put.
Hearing you both describe it, because growing up, and this is a sensation that has disappeared really, but I grew up in the 80s as a kid and as a teenager in the 90s, and we did not have this sensation, like going outside on your own for basically as long as the sun was up and just returning only because you were very hungry and only because if you didn't return, your mother was going to just deprive you of a dessert or something like that and ground you for a week. Not because you were in danger or anything like that. That was the norm. Like you would have gaggles upon gaggles of kids just roaming the streets. When I say streets, don't imagine any avenue or anything. I'm talking like narrow, relatively narrow streets in very in areas where it was only homes, let's say. So you would have all these kids that would go almost to the edge of the suburb, and nobody would bat an eyelid. Nobody would feel that there was any problem with security, or these kids would have any issues. Even if something happened to them, there would be even a stranger, an adult somewhere who would take care of things and then call the actual parents and stuff. So there was this feeling that you didn't really have anything to fear, as long as the bubble held, of the country held, and you didn't get invaded by anyone. But as long as that stayed as a constant, then you were fine. Because maybe that was because we were, up until the late 90s, an extremely homogeneous, ethnically homogeneous society. I don't know. You had only Greeks for ages to see. If you saw someone that was not a Greek, that was exotic. That was amazing. That was something that you would talk about for months. Like, I saw this person and this person was English, or this person was, I don't know, even if they were American, even more so. Like, they were American. They come from this place where everything is huge and you drive straight for hours, and this is actually a thing that can happen, that sort of thing. So we didn't really have that. Nowadays, though, and when I say nowadays, for the last couple of decades, kids don't grow up like this. They don't have this sense of security. Instead, you have people needing to have, iron guards in their, sorry about that, having iron guards in their windows and be afraid of having anything left open or unlocked, because home invasion is an extremely frequent thing that can happen.
Because of the economic situation.
You don't have any, exactly. You don't have any kids outside playing. You don't have parents feeling comfortable not knowing where their kids are. And, so on and so forth. So it's two very, very different cohorts, different situations completely.
Well,
So yeah.
interesting you guys say that. From my point of view, when I was growing up, like, Baines was saying, there's that element of danger, and it was for me, I think the place where my dad grew up was a very, very small country town, like close to a mining town actually, where like Kalgoorlie, so it's famous gold mining town. Kalgoorlie, Boulder, these twin cities or twin towns where there was mining going on, and that was and also Pinjarra as well. So that was a logging town. So these places are really famous for that, but they were quite rural and quite dangerous in a lot of ways, like what you were saying about Baines. And my dad grew up in a very working class like environment, very, very rural working class, but almost working class royalty in that they were like, very much at the core of that kind of stuff. So they were like very political and like very well connected politically and stuff like that with the left wing kind of parties and stuff like that.
Oh.
But my dad didn't like that at all. He did not like like this was growing up like hunting and fishing and all this kind of stuff, and with guns, always with guns and all that kind of stuff. And my dad grew up as an expert hunter and shooter, and like he was really good at that. But I think that he really did not like that at all, and he wanted to get out of that and just completely do something different with his life. So he became he joined the bank when when being part of the bank back then was considered like that was really super white collar kind of thing to do. And because like the bank manager was one of the big authorities in town next to the mayor and the doctors and the priests, all these kind of things were the major authorities. And he eventually became a bank manager, and when I was growing up he was a bank manager, and he would be like, a major figure in the town. When we were in Busselton, he was one of the major kind of like, like authorities in the town almost, because of, that was the status that bank managers had, in that time. So yeah, I grew up in a very different environment to what my dad grew up in, because he divorced us from a lot of the rest of the family. So the rest of the family stayed more working class, and my part of the family didn't. We stayed more, more middle class, more upper middle class kind of stuff. And we were around, like yacht clubs and all this kind of stuff. So it was quite different. And like, so there was a lot more safety and a lot more sophistication than that rest of the family, which would be a very weird disconnect for me, seeing the rest of the family and how they live, and not being able to understand their experiences. And so when I was growing up and I was watching mainly British TV, stuff like this, that was the culture I identified with more, watching like To the Manor Born and Goodies, Doctor Who, Yes Minister, stuff like this. And I really did strongly identify it with all that, because that was mainly about no, not Benny Hill, funnily enough, but that was more mainly directed towards that middle class kind of upper middle class kind of stuff. So yeah, that was influenced me a lot, and my own pretensions and stuff like that is based on that. But yeah, we would like stay with other parts of the family who stayed more wild, like you were talking about, those wild kind of adults, and they were like that, which was a very huge huge kind of revelation to me, to be around those kind of people, because I didn't really knew they existed, and like I've got this uncle who used to be a mining explorer, so they'd go to like far-flung corners of the globe looking out for, like major oil deposits. So he'd be like in the Gobi Desert in Mongolia or North Africa or Egypt or something, or, in the wild wastelands of Alaska or something like this. I don't know, just all over the place. And he'd tell these weird stories of these places he's visited, in his prospecting job and these teams that he led. But he was always, you know, a heavy drinker and all this kind of thing, and he was incredibly wild and just someone beyond my experience of what's normal. And just to be exposed to that was like to have a window on a different part of life. So yeah, what you said, it really is quite evocative. It brings back those kind of memories. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, when I was a child, that's what I wanted to do as a job. I wanted to grow up to be a mining prospector, like my uncle. But unfortunately, I didn't get those qualifications.
Well, when I think back to more of my experiences, as a whole, I guess, as a kid, not as a whole, I guess in response to what we had been talking about concerning, you know, national fears, you know, what kind of things like that did we have to think about? It's interesting because I never, especially since I was born in 1985. So by the time I was grown, you know, the threat of nuclear war and stuff like that, it had been tempered quite a bit. But how it tended to materialize here in the U.S. Was that we had a surge in patriotism, in a sense. You know, America's number one, you know, fuck the commies, that kind of stuff.
Morning in America,
yeah, Reaganomics. But, you know, I think what we did was we kind of covered what fear we had, that sense of the sword of Damocles kind of hanging over your head with, well, we're America, we're number one, we're going to come out big, we're going to come out strong, raise that flag, sing that song, everybody get together, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And then, but what's interesting, I think, where it fed into my experience in making at least Putrid Meat, at least, is there was a counterculture to that. That's where you have stuff come in, you know, like more like punk and heavy metal and, you know, stuff that wasn't so mainstream, that was a lot of times critical of that line of thought, you know. And so, and of course, I mean, I was 5. I didn't know what thrash metal was, but you saw these guys around, you know, and you always kind of thought like, well, what is that? You know, what's that guy with that long hair and stuff? You're seeing pictures of them. They're torn up jeans and they're snarling and they're playing guitar. And, you know, they're so different than the guy wearing the business suit, you know, going to make his, you know, vast fortune and, you know, make America great, you know, the whole Reagan thing. But so that was the counterculture. And as I grew up, when I came into my own, that for some reason, I mean, of course, I loved the music. I grew to love the music, but also just the imagery of it, just that complete and utter other, it enthralled me so much that I made Putrid Meat. I mean, they're in this post-apocalyptic world. It wasn't taken out by nukes, but it's, you know, the kind of thing that you see in a lot of movies, desert wasteland, ruined cities, you know, mutants and stuff like that. Yeah. And that's what that counterculture is. That's the scenario for when when we didn't win. That's what happened, you know? The more I think back about that, that really fed into it. God, it really did.
Well, I just can see it in your comics, man. It's all over. It's very clear. I mean, I remember looking at your comics originally way back and telling you like, oh man, I know those dudes, like Bones and stuff like that. Like, I love those post-apocalyptic movies too, like all the Mad Max like rip-offs, like the lower budget ones and all that. I know that, but it's also, and then the characters though, like those heavy metal 80s looking characters. I'm like, holy cow, those dudes were like in my school and in my neighborhood at least. Like I saw them, and they were older, and they were like, I mean, make a huge impression, man. So yeah, I mean, I can see it. it kind of really takes me back, actually, when I look at some of your comics. It's like, wow. Kind of a time warp, future/past kind of thing.
What a time. What a time. I say that being all of 5 years old by the end of the 80s, but you know what I mean? I don't remember the Satanic Panic or anything like that, but I do,
Me neither, really.
How people reacted in hindsight and stuff. And, you know, one of the things that we talk about here in the U.S. is that we used to, at least, they say it a lot in small towns, is, you know, it's so safe, you don't have to lock your doors. And that's always been kind of a source of pride for some parts of America. You know, you don't have to lock your doors. But it's like that came from such an innocent time. And through, like, in the 80s, we still considered ourselves quite innocent to an extent. We had the Vietnam War and stuff like that, but that had kind of washed away a little bit, I think, you know, and we were considering ourselves quite great again. But then you get into the 90s and things start becoming a bit more sarcastic in a sense, at least with like the grunge and stuff like that. But grunge is where that sarcasm started to become a little bit more mainstream. And then you know, as time went on and more stuff happened, and the war in the Middle East broke out, and we had 9/11 and all that stuff. And it's like, for us, for our generation, our innocence became stripped away in a sense. It's like a coming of age, you know what I mean, in a sense. And I think that's what we've been going through here. And so I think that's more or less, not to make a big overinflated thing out of it, I think that's where I got the tone for my comic without ever really realizing it. That's just how it was. That's just how it always made sense to me. If I had made it like Bones is waving an American flag, that would be absurd. It would be absurd.
Right.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yeah.
No, this is so interesting because now it makes me think how I would, if you asked me 15 years ago, I would never, I really imagine myself taking all the time and energy that it takes to make a historical comic and actually sit down and write about World War II Greece. That was not really in my plans, I have to say. Yeah, but it happened as a very personal need of mine. Now that I hear Deirdre talk about her experience growing up, and also the experiences that shaped what went into her comic, like we, as Greeks, we grew up with a very, very powerful dissonance that still exists today. And the dissonance is that from one side, we were a timeless nation, an ageless nation that has a lot of glory and a lot of prestige, let's say, in the thing that we have achieved as a nation, as a people, as a race, call it what you like it. And that's one thing. But on the other hand, we are also the losers. We are the ones that we are taught to sort of point at ourselves and laugh at ourselves or demean ourselves voluntarily, like drop into the mud and roll into the mud as being completely useless people as a people. Because if we don't, we are called very different names that are very, very bad. And these are wounds that we are still leaking from the time of the junta, which was a very, very traumatic time for the Greeks. And it had a very specific motto. It was Greece of the Christian Greeks, okay, which basically hit at the core of the identity that carried us through at least since the revolution. And anyone who was a prideful Greek or had pride in, or at least solace in being a Christian and stuff, then was immediately associated with a totalitarian, far right-wing asshole. Sorry, but that was, and that is still the connection that is being made. Whereas up until before the junta, that was not something that happened. It was like, we are a very small nation, we have very few resources, that we try and we create, we work very hard and we create and we succeed. That was the culture before that. So I grew up with this kind of dissonance of, yes, be proud of who you are, but also be very ashamed of who you are. Because every cohort that is alive is trash, and every cohort that has come before you is glorious. So we have to wait to die to be amazing, in a sense. So when the whole financial crisis happened, and Greece became the scapegoat or the problem or the cancer of the world, we were dragged through the mud in a way that still hurts a lot. And I feel it right now as I talk, because we were basically told that we should not exist because we are everyone's problem. And I wanted to go back to the time where we had an identity that was more realistic to who we are as a people. So, and also to demonstrate that we are not trash, we are not like what we are being profiled to be. And this is our contribution to the world currently, like not in the ancient times or even the Byzantine times, but nowadays, what did we do as Greeks? How did we conduct ourselves through history? This is who we are. We are not trash. We are not profligate people that like to live off and mooch off everybody else. And we like to carry our own weight, which is actually real about Greeks. So that's why I said, okay, I'm going to go back and revisit the history, the modern history up until current day, and not glorify anything, but also not attack anything. I want to present exactly who we are with our flaws and our assets, and just be people like every other nation in the world. So that's why I started without Moonlight, actually, now that I think about it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
There's a long history.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting a bit over time here, so we'll have to call it off. But it'd be interesting to hear other people's formative experiences and how they helped to create in whatever small parts, to create the webcomics they do now, or, at least the artistic works. So, thank you guys for being part of the QUACKCAST number 476.
Thank you too.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure to have all you guys on. Marvelous people, and hear you talking about your life histories and your formative experiences. Okay. All right. See you guys. See
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.